Welcome, everybody. Good morning. We have meeting number 24 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defense. Pursuant to Standing Order 108-2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, September 16th, 2025, the committee is meeting to begin its consideration of the nexus between national defense, national security, and the critical mineral sector. Today's meeting is taking place in hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders, and members are attending in person and remotely using the Zoom application. Before we begin, I ask participants to consult the guidelines on the table. These measures are to help prevent audio feedback incidences and to protect the health and safety of our interpreters. I would like to remind the witnesses and members, please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. If you wish to speak, please raise your hand. And for those on Zoom, please raise the hand function, and the clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. For interpretations, use your earpiece and select the appropriate channel. Again, all comments should be addressed through the chair. Now, I'd like to welcome our witnesses. Dr. Michael Byers, Professor via video conferencing, Christopher Hernandez-Roy, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow Americas Program, Center for Strategic and International Studies, and Elizabeth Stein, if I pronounce that correctly, I apologize, Associate Dean, Graduate Studies, Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary. You will proceed, I'll proceed with 5 minutes for each of you to opening statements, and why don't we open it up to, it doesn't have anybody in particular order. Dr. Myers, over to you.
Thank you very much. Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everyone.
Happy to take questions in French. When I received this invitation, I couldn't help but wonder why you had chosen me. And I think the answer is that I have been working on issues of Arctic security and Arctic sovereignty for the last 20 years. And 20 years ago became very involved in an issue of national security and foreign investment. Some of you will remember a significant interest of public policy in 2007 and 2008 when Canada's largest space company, McDonald Detweiler and Associates, now known as NDA, wished to sell its space division to a large American company, ATK. And the reason it became an issue of national security was that McDonald Detweiler and Associates had a synthetic aperture radar satellite, RadarSat-2, that had been built precisely to provide surveillance of Canada's Arctic waters and to measure sea ice and to essentially fulfill an Arctic sovereignty and security role, and had done so with $500 million of Canadian government pre-purchased imagery. After an extensive investigation, I believe I testified before 3 parliamentary committees on that issue, and others, of course, weighed in. Then Industry Minister Jim Prentice, the late Jim Prentice, invoked the Investment Canada Act for the first time to block the purchase of a Canadian company by a foreign company, and he did so under what was called the net benefit test, because the Investment Canada Act at that time did not include a national security test. And I and others recommended that the Act be amended to include a national security test, and it was, and it has been amended again. And I believe the government is currently in the process of adopting regulations that would provide even more content to that issue. So that's why I think I'm here. I'm not a specialist in national law. I am a specialist in international law, and I can tell you that international law allows for a very broad exception for national security purposes. So blocking a sale for national security purposes does not raise issues of international law. It simply goes to the issue of the domestic legislation. Now, again, I spent a lot of time looking at Arctic security issues, including with regards to China. I think it's important with regards to Chinese interest in Canadian natural resources to take a deep breath, not get overly excited. We export a lot of bitumen to China. We export nickel to China. In fact, there's a Chinese-owned company that has a mine in northern Quebec that ships nickel to China. And the Prime Minister was recently in Beijing seeking to expand trading relationships with that country. Now, I'm not naive. I think one needs to make sure that Chinese companies are not accessing certain critical minerals in Canada. I'm thinking here of rare earth elements in particular, but it's I think important to focus on the specific minerals and to not get too excited in regard all trade with China or all investment with China on what might be broadly defined as critical minerals as necessarily a bad thing. I also have spent a lot of time on Canada-U.S. relations. I was for 5 years a professor of international law at Duke University in North Carolina. Our relationship with the United States at the moment is unpredictable. To say the least, and requires that we not lock ourselves into any new constraints at this moment. And here I'm speaking to the fact that the Trump administration has indicated a desire to negotiate a bilateral agreement with Canada on critical minerals, and I think that Prime Minister Carney is right to point out that that issue should be deferred as part of the larger Canada, U.S., Mexico trade agreement renegotiations. You don't give away a strong card before the poker game starts. And I'm going to close by simply saying that I am concerned by a decision that was made in 2020 that probably was a wise decision in 2020 to enter into a Canada-U.S. joint action plan on critical minerals. Under that plan, the Canadian government and the U.S. Department of Defense have jointly acquired equity interests in, I believe, 6 Canadian mining companies so far, including Canada's only mine for rare earth elements in the Yukon. I'm becoming concerned that that could be a problem, at least if it were to allow the United States Department of Defense to secure critical minerals and specifically rare earth elements in a time of shortage in Canada. So I'm not looking for any governmental decision on this right now. It's proper that it's part of the CUSMA negotiations, but we need to be alert to maintain our sovereignty over rare earth elements and certain other key critical minerals. The last thing I will say on the United States, to bring it back to the beginning of my comments, is that back in 2008, the sale that Jim Prentice blocked was a sale to a U.S. company. So we have said no to purchases from the United States before for national security reasons. In worst case scenarios, we should be prepared to do so again. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
And your value here and your participation. So thank you. Over to you, Christopher Hernandez-Roy. You have up to 5 minutes.
Thanks very much. Bonjour à tous. Chairman
Good
Susan.
morning, everyone.
Savard Tremblay, distinguished members of the committee. I'm very pleased to share my views with you today. My employer, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, does not take policy positions, so my remarks and my opinions that I express today are entirely my own and don't necessarily reflect CSIS. Just like coal and steel production in the 19th century and oil perhaps in the 20th century, critical minerals are now keystones of national capabilities alongside chip fabrication, aerospace and advanced manufacturing, information technology, artificial intelligence, and energy. The relationship between mining and defense is being reshaped by a fundamental shift in how critical minerals are perceived and governed. What was once largely driven by consumer product and energy transition objectives is now increasingly framed through a national security and industrial strategy lens. This shift is unfolding against a backdrop of heavy dependence on non-trusted or adversarial jurisdictions for mining, processing, and refining, exposing defense industries to geopolitical risk, trade disruptions, and coercive leverage. In response, Canada and allied governments are moving to re-anchor mineral supply chains domestically and within trusted frameworks, or networks, I should say. Bilateral and multilateral instruments and agreements are increasingly explicit about strengthening the resilience of supply chains and ensuring a secure sourcing of critical minerals essential for defense, rather than regular consumer market or climate goals alone. Canada can position itself as a cornerstone of national security and defense critical mineral supply for Canada and for its allies. Canada has reserves of all 12 minerals that NATO identifies as essential for defense manufacturing and active production of most of them, in addition to other minerals on the U.S. Department of Defense's critical list and the EU critical mineral list as well. Trade frictions between the United States and Canada has accelerated a push to diversify defense-related mineral exports, deepening ties with leading Western economies through the G7 Critical Minerals Action Plan, or with Europe through the Security and Defense Partnership and the SAFE Initiative, as well as aligning more closely with NATO's rearmament agenda. In this context, minerals themselves could become a form of defense currency, an alternative pathway for Canada to meet readiness and burden-sharing objectives, in particular the 1.5% above the 3.5% NATO hardcore commitments to defense. On the demand side, while regular consumer demand still drives markets, defense is becoming an increasingly important market signal, but one which is not always clear in terms of which specific minerals, in what volumes, on what timelines companies will require them. Unlike EV or battery markets, defense-driven demand is mediated through classified planning, procurement systems, and shifting threat assessments. L'alignement des politiques et des cadres réglementaires.
Alignment of regulatory policies and frameworks remains another key challenge in the ties between mining operations and defense. The authorities responsible for defense purchasing, industry policy agencies, and mineral regulatory agencies often operate under different mandates, schedules, and risk tolerance levels. Even when there is a political consensus on the need to prioritize defense critical minerals, this does not automatically translate into faster authorization processes nor into clearer regulatory decisions. Recent efforts, particularly through the Building Canada Act and the Major Projects Office, aiming to streamline environmental assessments, to centralize authorizations for major projects, and to speed up development deemed to be of national interest, reflect an attempt to reconcile the urgency of the critical minerals industry with the integrity of the regulatory framework.
At the center of the mining defense relationship. Defense critical minerals projects, particularly in processing and refining, are capital intensive and also involve technology and scale-up risk. I've argued in the past that Canada should establish its own version of a U.S. DPA Title III to co-invest in critical defense minerals, signaling government commitment and encouraging private capital. Perhaps the new Canadian Critical Mineral Sovereign Fund will achieve some of these objectives if it focuses some of its investments on defense critical minerals. Processing and midstream capacity represents one of the most acute bottlenecks. Investments in rare earth processing, magnet manufacturing, and recycling illustrate both opportunity and the difficulty of building mainstream capacity fast enough to meet defense timelines and the need to quickly pivot away from adversarial sources. but progress is being made with the Saskatchewan Research Council's rare earth facility, Rio Tinto's scandium production plant in Quebec, or Ucore Rare Earth Metals Kingston facility, for example. For miners, all of these dynamics force strategic choices. Some will remain focused on supplying feedstock, while others may pursue deeper integration as strategic partners to processors, defense companies, or governments. Debates over strategic stockpiles, direct public equity, and alignment of mineral production with defense commitments illustrate how miners are increasingly operating within a geopolitical as well as a commercial calculus. Taken together, these dynamics highlight a central tension. Defense-driven strategic intent is accelerating, but the institutional, commercial, and industrial mechanisms needed to translate that intent into predictable demand, bankable projects, and resilient supply chains are still catching up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Stein, over to you, 5 minutes.
Honourable Chair, Vice Chairs and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to appear before you today on this important study examining the nexus between national defence, national security and Canada's critical minerals sector. I am a law professor at the University of Calgary, where I teach a course in critical minerals, regulatory frameworks and geopolitics. I have specialized in this area for the past 6 years. I am also a fellow at the Centre for Military Security and Strategic Studies at the University of Calgary. At the outset, I would like to make 10 recommendations. First, that the Canadian definition of critical minerals be revised to bring it in line with our changing geopolitical realities. Our current definition states that we must have the geological potential to produce a mineral for it to be considered a critical mineral in Canada. We need to focus on minerals that are critical for Canada. And by that I mean minerals that are critical to the energy transition, the digital transition, critical infrastructure and agriculture, aerospace and advanced manufacturing, and most importantly, national security and defense. Second, that a clear and transparent methodology for the identification of critical minerals be designed accordingly, and that it be revised biannually in accordance with the latest scientific advances. Third, that the 2021 Canadian Critical Mineral List be revised in consequence. Fourth, that Canada make haste with the establishment of the critical minerals stockpile that was announced in Budget 2025. And I will note here that Eisenhower set the golden standard of a stockpile that can withstand a 5-year war effort. Fifth, that a healthy portion of Canada's increased defence budget should be set aside for feedstocks in the form of critical minerals, as well as the securing of critical mineral supply chains, so production, processing, manufacturing, and supply. Sixth, that as a country we exercise vigilance not only when it comes to Chinese investments, but also to those by the US Department of Defense or Department of War, particularly when they come tied to 100% offtake agreements, such as we have recently seen. Seventh, our priority as a country should be first to secure our own needs and then to provide minerals to our NATO allies. And by our NATO allies, I'm referring predominantly to CETA, such as the recent agreement we entered into with Germany. Eighth, we should look to the global south for alliances when it comes to securing minerals that we do not have, notably South Africa, Namibia, and Kazakhstan. Ninth, there is a careful balance to be tread between being a useful ally to the US and putting ourselves into a Greenland position. My submission is that the US would rather look to Australia for sourcing its minerals at present, and we should look to Europe for offtake markets, and not to unduly remind the US of our riches. 10th, during the Second World War, we positioned ourselves to be the world's largest supplier of minerals, but we failed to build up our own military force. We should learn from that escapade, notably now that we can no longer take US protection or benevolence for granted. To summarize, Canada stands at a strategic inflection point. There can be no national security without critical minerals. I look forward to your questions and to discussing how Canada can strengthen its defence postures through a more resilient, secure and strategically aligned critical minerals sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to go with our first round of questions, and we're going to start off with Mr. Kibble for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for your help in letting us understand the connection that we're trying to make today. We mentioned the 12 NATO, this is for Mr. Hernandez-Roy, the 12 NATO identified critical minerals. Which of those are the top three in terms of importance to national defense in Canada?
It's not easy to answer that, and I'll tell you why. It depends. Certain minerals are obviously required to build certain weapon systems and to build your defense industry. But that might not be where the greatest risk is. Where the greatest risk is where the bottlenecks are. So, for instance, a metal like niobium, which Canada does have reserves of, but is not yet producing, as far as I recall, is one of those metals that is at the greatest risk of disruption. And it's essential, for instance, in the commercial market for strengthening car bodies. It makes a super steel alloy that makes steel much stronger. But it's also essential for building aircraft, for building other types of vehicles that require very light and very resistant metals.
Explains then some of the risks, bottleneck risks. Which minerals does that apply to?
Well, I mean, this for niobium, for things like rare earths, which is, I think, what most people focus on, certainly what the media has focused on. The risks are simply that for some of these metals, China not only controls the market, but has virtually a monopoly control of the market and has engaged in price manipulation, has engaged in using their market to use it as a trade cudgel with most recently the United States, but other countries as well. Japan had a problem with China for a while, and their lock on certain minerals makes Western industrial processes entirely dependent on that.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned DPA3, and I saw some smiles and nods. Could you explain that a little bit more, both of you? And I didn't see for Dr. Byers, but that seemed important. So if you could expand on that a little bit more. I'll start with Mr. Hernandez-Roy and maybe...
So the Defense Production Act, Title III, has grant-making authority to invest in critical mineral projects, mostly to get them off the ground in both the United States and in Canada. This stems out of the U.S.-Canada Critical Minerals, I forget the exact title, agreement, roadmap, action plan that was signed at the tail end of the first Trump administration. And the first investments in Canada weren't made until the Biden administration. And one or two, if memory serves, have continued in the second Trump administration. As far as I recall, these are grants. These are not taking a stake in a mine.
Thank you. And Ms. Stein, you mentioned about a recommendation for 5-year stockpile of critical minerals and rare earths, et cetera. Do you know where, relative to the 12 NATO, or just maybe in general, where Canada stands in terms of our stockpile? Do we have anything? Are we at 1 year, 2 year? Or do we have the capacity to do that? Perhaps you could expand there, please.
We actually stand nowhere. We've announced a intention to start, but it is quite shocking where we are at the moment. The US has announced a $12 billion critical minerals stockpile. They used to have, after the First World War, they used to have this 5-year capacity under Eisenhower. Under Nixon, they shrank it to 1-year capacity. Nixon sold it off to balance the budget. Because at that stage, the thinking was that wars wouldn't be long anymore because of nuclear capacity. I think we've seen recently, for instance, with the Ukraine war, that wars are fought differently. Wars can be long. So that thinking stands to be qualified. But there's also Australia, who has a $1.2 stockpile that they're investing in.
Okay, thank you very much. And that is shocking that we have zero stockpile. Perhaps, Mr. Hernandez-Roy, you could expand on the risks of foreign ownership of mines. We've said that we don't want the U.S. to have too much control. Would that same apply to China? And in general, what are some of the risks of losing control of these and especially in the light of trying to build stockpiles that we shockingly don't have?
Sure. Before I answer that, if I could just make one brief comment about the stockpile, which is something that in a paper I wrote on critical minerals for defense last year, I also recommended. This was back in February of last year. There's an interesting, another interesting angle to stockpiles which could be considered. Maintaining large government stockpiles is expensive and could be very static. But another thing that can be considered is defense companies, if they have stockpiles for their own production, let's say at the end of a given year, they have some minerals that they haven't used. Those could be, like tax breaks could be given to them to encourage private companies to stockpile.
And we only have a few seconds, but if you could just talk about risks of foreign ownership.
I mean, I don't think all foreign ownership is clearly risky, but the risks of foreign ownership are that the mineral supplies can be constrained or can be, they can be constrained in moments of
shipped out of the country and taken away?
Well, that means the Canadian authorities could do something about that.
Do you feel that would be important to control flow of these critical minerals out of Canada and into potential adversaries or other countries?
I think that the export and import, but in this case the export of minerals and other commodities that are sensitive to national defense should absolutely be reviewed, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cabot. Ms. Lapointe, over to you, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Byers, I would like to ask you some questions related to your expertise in Arctic sovereignty and security. How does the growing interest in Arctic resources, including critical minerals and rare earth elements, affect Canada's sovereignty and security considerations in the North?
Well, thank you very much for that question. From a broader sovereignty and security perspective, it doesn't really matter much whether the rare earth elements or other critical minerals are located in southern Ontario or in Nunavut. We are, in a lot of this conversation, talking about foreign governments or foreign companies gaining equity interests and the ability in some cases to decide whether to ship those resources abroad, even in circumstances where they're needed in Canada for security reasons. So just to make that clear, that issue of control over the products of a mine is a nationwide issue, and that's what we've been talking about so far. In terms of the Arctic, we have 100% control that is undisputed over all of the land territory in the Canadian Arctic. Our only dispute concerning Tiny Hands Island was resolved in a very friendly way with Denmark 3 years ago. So there's no question of sovereignty over land, and there's no country that disputes that sovereignty. There is, of course, a current president in the United States that has expressed a desire to make all of Canada the 51st state of the USA, but that is a somewhat different issue. We do have a couple of maritime boundary disputes, one of which is in the Beaufort Sea. There were negotiations on that between Canada and the United States during the Biden negotiation. It should be relatively easy to resolve. It, in terms of resources, mostly concerns hydrocarbons that could be in the continental shelf. Very expensive to access, not feasible at the current world price for oil. And we have it's not a boundary dispute, but a dispute over the legal status of the Northwest Passage. The United States has long held that it's an international strait that foreign vessels can use without Canadian permission, and Canada takes the view that it is Canadian internal waters and that our consent is required. But we've agreed to disagree with the United States on this since 1988 in a moment of brilliant Canadian diplomacy by then Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and partnering with U.S. President Ronald Reagan. So in terms of sovereignty and critical minerals, my concern isn't about anyone gaining sovereignty over Canadian territory. My concern comes back to the issue as to whether we would be able to say no in the event that a foreign-owned mine, a foreign-owned mining company were to choose to ship that resource out of Canada, even if it was needed here, let's say for the production of a fleet of fighter jets in Canada, where we need it to access to some rare earth elements, and saw those shipped off to China or the United States. That's a critical issue for me. I'm very uncomfortable about the fact that the U.S. Department of Defense is acquiring an equity interest in some of these mines in Canada. That strikes me as a problem in our current situation, and I hope that we look at that during the renegotiation of CUSMA.
And Dr. Byers, as the interest in Arctic resources grow, in your opinion, what kind of behavior could we expect from foreign interests testing Canada's boundaries?
Well, again, I don't see any threat to our sovereignty over land. Let me just say that Russia is the largest country in the world. It already owns half of the Arctic unquestionably without dispute, and it is seriously bogged down in Ukraine. China certainly has a very large appetite for resources of all kinds, including critical minerals, rare earth elements, but has found itself able to access what it needs through foreign investment and trade around the world. And we are, in a deep trading relationship with China. When I look outside of my office window at the University of British Columbia, I can see dozens of cargo ships waiting to load Canadian natural resources to take them to China. So it's not so much, the fact that China is investing in Canadian resources, that it is purchasing Canadian resources. It's, do we have sovereign control over particular minerals that we need for our defense purposes? And as long as we have the ability to say no, which we do have under the Investment Canada Act, I don't actually see a problem, provided that the government is vigilant. And there was a period in the first couple of years of the Trudeau government where that vigilance shifted away. It slipped. And we saw a couple of high-tech companies, relatively small companies, that were purchased by Chinese companies when they really should have been subject to a national security review. I think we've got past that.
Thank you. I just want to get a question into Monsieur Hernandez Roy. I wanted to ask you, how do U.S. policymakers view Canada or view partners like Canada in an effort to reliably secure defense-relevant mineral supply chains?
I mean, this administration in particular, but going back to the previous one as well, has probably recognized the importance of critical minerals for defense sooner than anybody else in the Western world. And this administration in particular has been laser focused on finding critical minerals that it deems as necessary for U.S. national security, and particularly the focus seems to be repeatedly on rare earths. So you've seen the interest in Ukraine, the interest in Greenland, partnerships with Australia, interest in Canadian minerals, and interest in minerals from places further afield, particularly in South America. And Africa, although I don't know much about the critical minerals landscape in Africa. So it's a strategy to find alternative sources of critical minerals that don't go through China, basically. And wherever those are, the United States is interested in finding them.
Thank you. Thank you. Monsieur Savard-Tremblay, you have 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to all the witnesses. Thank you for being here and for your statements. I don't want to ask a question of anyone in particular, so feel free to speak up. So could we talk about the agreement after President Biden came into office? It was an agreement with Prime Minister Trudeau at the time for mutual access between companies, mutual access through companies of each country to critical minerals of both countries. Could you just come back to that briefly so that we can have a good understanding of what that agreement involved?
My apologies for my response in English, but I'm trying to save your ears from my horrible accent here. So the Mineral Security Partnership that was entered into by Canada and the United States is more or less dead in the water at the moment. It exists in name still, but nothing is happening with it. Its successor is twofold. There is the G7 alliance that is spearheaded by Canada, and then there's the recent endeavor by the Trump White House, which convened multiple other nations. So nothing very much has come of that. There were a few investments that were made by both countries together. But I want to use this occasion to give you one very concrete example of a U.S. investment that can be detrimental to Canada, if I may. And it is a Department of Defense investment in a Montreal company by the name of N5. They manufacture germanium wafers. Germanium, to have you understand, is used for things like night vision goggles, which is military equipment. So germanium is in very short supply. China controls up to 97% of the world's germanium. We therefore want to make very sure that the US doesn't control Canadian access to germanium, and it's a Montreal company.
Mais ça, justement, on sait qu'il y a un effort qui...
Precisely, we know that an effort has been made, but we'll go back to the U.S., but an effort has been made in recent years to exclude China from the critical minerals sector. Was that enough, first of all?
Excluded China in that, but we've also excluded ourselves. This has only been to the benefit of the United States in the example that I'm giving you at the moment. So this has not been to the benefit of Canada, is what I'm saying.
Mais n'y avait-il pas quand même la nécessité de...
But wasn't it necessary, nevertheless, to regain the trust of the U.S. by showing that for such strategic areas, China, which remains a power that is worrisome?
We have seen that in multiple of the critical minerals domains where we have previously been a supplier of choice to the United States, they've selected in the meantime to enter into contracts with Australia rather than Canada. So my submission to you through the chair is that we have not really succeeded in gaining their confidence.
hand up as well.
Pardon?
Monsieur Byers. Yeah.
I agree with everything that Professor Stein is saying, and I'm grateful for her expertise. I just wanted to raise a related issue. It's not just about preventing, let's say, the Chinese government from acquiring control over a Canadian mine, but it's also a question of stimulating investment in Canadian mining of rare earth elements and other critical minerals. And one of the problems at the moment is that investors are wary to invest in a Canadian deposit because of the possibility that China could then start dumping that same product, and therefore undermining the profitability of the enterprise. And so one response to that is for governments to acquire equity interests in the mine, because governments don't need to make a profit. But there is an alternative approach. This was the subject of a Globe and Mail editorial. So the editorial board of the Globe and Mail a while ago suggesting that actually having a government-provided price floor would accomplish much of the same thing. So in other words, the Canadian government would guarantee to a mining company and its investors that when they started to ship product, they would receive at least a minimum price, and investors could make long-term investment decisions based upon that certainty. So I just want to put that on your table. It's not necessarily just a question of excluding bad actors, but also protecting investors in Canada from the possibility of dumping by bad actors that might want to discourage a rare earth element mining industry in this country. Thank you.
On a encore du temps.
Any time left? How much? Fine. So continuing, that was very interesting as a first point of what we could bring in to attract investments. Now, the question is also how to draw the line between an investment and a taking of possession that would be strategic and could be detrimental or could have a red line that we shouldn't go beyond. For example, would it be, I'll even speak more broadly, the Investment Canada Act, is it sufficient as it now stands?
I will have a try at that. Under the Investment Canada Act and under the international law on foreign investment, yes, Canada can stop a foreign investment and could also stop the export of a product during a time of crisis. The national security exception internationally is very broad. And as we saw in 2008, when there was no explicit national security exception in the Investment Canada Act, Jim Prentice still managed to read one in. So it's more a question of political will than anything else. As I said in my introduction, I understand the government is currently developing regulations that will give greater specificity and therefore greater certainty to investors. But rest assured that if we were in a situation of geopolitical crisis, that Canada could step in. But again, I worry we could end up, for instance, in a dispute with the Department of Defense, the Department of War in the United States, saying, no, look, we bought an equity interest, and under our contract, we have 100% right to use that product. And all of a sudden, you're into a dispute over that issue with the United States. We need to do better. This has to be part of the CUSMA negotiations. It should not be done bilaterally now. Thank you.
Ms. Gallant, you have 5 minutes.
Mr. Hernandez-Roy, with respect to the safeguards to protect sensitive sectors announced with the Prime Minister's strategic partnership with China, was it your understanding they would apply to critical minerals? The safeguards to protect the sensitive sectors announced in that strategic partnership with China.
Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with that enough to answer your question.
Dr. Stein?
Repeating your question, please.
With respect to the safeguards to protect sensitive sectors announced with the Prime Minister's strategic partnership with China, was it your understanding those as they would apply to the critical minerals?
It was not my understanding.
Okay. Should the government extend these safeguards to include the critical minerals?
I believe it should.
What kind of critical minerals is China going after around the world? And in particular, which minerals does Canada have that China has its eyes on?
We do have large reserves of rare earths. We've been talking about rare earths, but China already has a lot of rare earths at its availability. What we do have recently is a lot of gallium germanium. We have large stocks of nickel, and nickel is interesting because nickel is one of the few things that China does not control. It's Indonesia that controls nickel in the world. Also, our nickel is green because of the fact that we manufacture it with renewable energy. So it makes it highly desirable. It's low carbon. And nickel, as I'm sure you all know, is the ultimate war material going back to the Second World War because of the manufacture of various equipment. So that is one that we should definitely look at. But we should also look at things like cadmium, which is not even on our critical mineral list as it is defined at the moment.
Okay, last week the Minister of Natural Resources did not rule out Chinese state-owned companies from buying up Canadian companies that attract oil, gas, and critical minerals. What would be the consequence if this government were to approve such a sale?
I want to say that at the moment they can do it anyway. And I want to give you an example. There has been an outcry because of First Quantum Minerals, who you may recall owns a mine in Panama, a copper mine in Panama, and everybody's been saying that this is a Canadian mine that was nationalized by Panama. But First Quantum Minerals is owned 20% majoritarily by a Chinese company through the stock exchange. So what I'm saying is that many of the mines that we consider to be Canadian are essentially Chinese anyway.
Okay, what is the threat of Chinese state-owned companies to taking up stake or leasing infrastructure like they did with the Port of Darwin in Australia? Are there any indications the safeguards would extend to Chinese controlling our infrastructure?
I think there's always a risk. You may be aware of the Port of Zambia as well, Zambia in Africa, which was the government defaulted on a loan and, well, China took back the port.
Okay, the Port of Darwin in Australia was leased to a Chinese company for 99 years in 2015, but the Australian government is trying to reclaim ownership, which China has then threatened them with vague measures. China has long used economic coercion to defend its interests. What kind of measures could they impose from countries taking back ownership of their infrastructure?
It is very politically because China does not play by the same rules as the West.
Yes, Mr. Hernandez-Roy.
Can I answer that sort of in the context? I'm primarily Latin Americanist. Chinese control of infrastructure, particularly ports in Latin America, is a very big concern for the United States because some of these things, including the mega port in Chancay in Peru, are being built with dual-use specifications. And in the event of a crisis, not only can they restrict trade flows within the region, but within the region to North America, potentially they could be used for denial of area operations or refueling, et cetera. So having, and not only do they own and operate, they have the exclusive sort of almost sovereign right to some of these areas. So allowing that kind of a penetration is a huge risk. And you've seen the U.S. government recognize that with tactics that I don't agree with, but certainly a concern, for instance, in Panama with Hutchinson Ports controlling 2 of the 4 major ports in the Panama Canal on both ends. And the Panamanian government, the Supreme Court 2 weeks ago ruled that the contract would be null and void because the company basically didn't fulfill its contract. But the Chinese control energy systems, the electrical grid in Lima, Peru. They control a number of critical infrastructure, not just ports, but other things as well, that countries in Latin America have not paid enough attention to and are thus vulnerable to economic coercion should they try to pull back.
Ms. Gallant, I know Dr. Byers' hand is up. I'm going to pass over to Mr. Watchhorn, and maybe he can engage with you in this respect. Mr. Watchhorn. Possibly. Whatever Mr. Watchhorn wants. It's your time. It's your time, Mr. Watchhorn.
Dr. Byers, si vous voulez répondre à la question, allez-y.
Byers, if you want to answer the question, please go ahead.
I agree that some Latin American countries have not paid sufficient attention to Chinese investments in infrastructure. This hasn't happened in Canada with regards to major infrastructure like ports. And I do believe that if a Chinese company wished to buy the Port of Vancouver, that purchase would be blocked under the Investment Canada Act. So it's an issue, but it's not yet an issue in Canada, at least not to that degree. The other thing I just want to suggest very briefly is that you should distinguish between Chinese investments in mining operations located within Canada and Chinese investments in companies that are incorporated in Canada, but where the mining is taking place overseas. The majority of the world's mining industry is incorporated in Canada, but an awful lot of those operations do not involve our territory. So there's a distinction there. We should still be concerned about those operations overseas, but my main concern is with mines located here in our territory. Thank you.
Merci, Dr. Byers. Moi, j'ai une question.
Thank you, Dr. Byers. I have a question that's more specific. In Quebec, I know of two graphite mines more particularly. There's the Nouveau Monde one in Saint-Michel-des-Saints, which is operational. And even I believe that they're going to have a processing plant set up in Bécancour, which will follow through with the graphite production chain. But there's another case closer to here, which is a project that is not yet in production, which is Mine de la Loutre, which receives a lot of opposition from citizens, environmental opposition, and all kinds of opposition. I'd like to hear you, Professor Stein, on how we can reconcile the critical aspects of the mines we want to build versus public opinion. And often for mines, it's very negative.
Development. This is a very contentious mine, and I find it extremely ironic because for once, we don't have a First Nation opposition. We have a cottage community opposition here. And I'll just leave it at that. But yes, of course, there has to be responsible mining. There has to be sustainable mining industry practices. It is important. We are not engaged in a competition to mine to the bottom. We understand that. But I believe, and I am quite familiar with the Lumiko operation, I believe that they have crossed all their T's and dotted all their I's. It is unfortunate that in some occasions you will have people who are opposed. It is the not in my backyard situation. But if we want things, we will have mining. And if we want to have sovereignty within our country, then we must have mining within our country. Whether it is urban mining, by which I mean recycling, or greenfields mining, such as the Lumiko project, there has to be mining within the country and processing and refining within the country. And we have to make certain compromises.
On parlait de comment c'est problématique l'investissement.
We talked about how problematic foreign investment is in mining, but in that particular case of Lovico in La Loutre, $8 million has been invested by the American War Department for exploration. Ought that not to be a red light for us? regarding that project in particular?
Without a equity stake and without an offtake agreement. I get very concerned when there are offtake agreements involved. When it is just an investment, and that was really under the Mineral Security Partnership. So that was a good example of the functioning of the Mineral Security Partnership. It is the most recent tranche of investments by the Department of War that concern me. So that one really does not concern me.
Bon, mais, bonne question. Moi, j'ai eu la chance d'aller dans la région.
I had the good fortune of visiting the Abitibi region to see the results of abandoned mines and mines when it goes badly in terms of the environment. Often the Quebec government brings out contracts to restore sites of abandoned mines that have been contaminated. I'd like you to reassure us that modern practices are much better than what we've seen with abandoned mines back in the 60s and 70s, which pollute rivers in Abitibi. Remarkably, I've seen rivers that had spills of toxic products that made the river alkaline. The water looked beautiful, but there were no fish that could live in there. And I'd like you to tell us that things are better than they used to be.
It is a completely different game than what it was even in the 80s or 90s. It is simply not possible to operate in that way anymore. And mining, unfortunately, had a number of very poor operators in the past. And as you know, tailings or the residues of mining has been pumped into rivers. We've seen that in Abitibi and areas like that. It is an unfortunate legacy. One of the things that I've mentioned is circular mining, value from waste. So the idea is that we can rehabilitate these abandoned tailings, these abandoned mines, by getting some of the minerals like rare earths and cadmium and scandium from those tailings.
Interesting. Monsieur le Président, est-ce qu'il me reste du temps? Ou...
Chair, do I have any time left? Fine. So I would like to hear you, perhaps, Mr. Hernandez, on this. From a community viewpoint versus the need to extract minerals, how do we reconcile that so that people feel that they've really been consulted in these types of projects?
You'll forgive me for answering in English. If we were in a more relaxed setting, I could probably converse fully with you in French. How to determine the balance? I mean, in the past, the balance was achieved because if there was sufficient opposition to something, there were other sources of a particular mineral. And this is why China was able to dominate. One of the reasons that China was able to dominate the critical minerals refining and mining space, but particularly the refining, because they were willing to accept the environmental damage, the environmental externalities that come from that. Now we know that we can't rely on China. Not only can we not rely on it, but it's actively using its monopoly against the West when it suits it. So now we don't have that choice. And we must look at sources in Canada and in allied countries and develop them as responsibly as possible. Canada is developing, for instance, some refining technology. The Saskatchewan Research Council has this. There's an outfit in Kingston whose name I forget right now, which it's proprietary technology to refine rare earths in a much cleaner manner. And therefore, not only do we not have to, or not only are we trying to develop rare earth capacity in Canada, but we're developing rare earth capacity that's cleaner than anything that's made in China.
Thank you. Let me see. Monsieur Savard-Tremblay, you have...
Mr. Savard-Tremblay. Thank you. Let's continue in the discussion where we left it up earlier. In other words, this effort to make sure that we draw a line so that powers that might be considered as worrisome even in times of peace, for example, the People's Republic of China earlier asked you whether it was sufficient, and the gentleman online told us that the Investment Canada Act could be sufficient even without invoking the strategic aspect of it. Even without the strategic aspect, it could have been sufficient. But shouldn't we adopt the same formula toward the USA during a period when the USA is also a source of concern? And shouldn't we go according to exactly the same, without doing exactly what we did? Well, in recent years, we tried to exclude China from key aspects.
Caution a little, because the US is a lot closer than China. So I wouldn't antagonize the US overly by invoking the Investment Canada Act. What I do think we should do is something more subtle, and that is that we should be investing in our own. And we have a lot of defense money that we need to invest in defense. And there is no, and under the NATO agreement, there is no reason why we cannot invest this money into feedstock, into critical minerals, into our own mining. And if we do that, then the US can't do it.
Est-ce que, je ne sais pas si monsieur avait la main.
I don't know if the gentleman had raised his hand or not. All right. When you say you want to add something, please go ahead.
In Canada needs to be looked at within a broader context of the US-Canada relationship. Critical minerals are one of the aces in Canada's hand when it comes to the United States, and the government has rightly not given away an agreement on critical minerals, as the Mexicans have already done, ahead of the CUSMA renegotiation. But given that geography will join the United States and Canada forever, and given that the United States has to be our friend, whether we like it or not, critical minerals has to play an important role in that. And I don't think, I mean, there may be certain very, very narrow investments that might be, that could rise to the level of some sort of a review. But all in all, this is an area where Canada has a strength to play in our broader economic relationship, which with our largest trade partner, which is going to remain our largest trade partner despite the political problems now for the foreseeable future.
Je présume que je n'ai plus de temps.
I suppose my time is up. Oh, there was a hand raised here. Yes.
Thank you. I just want to add briefly that this might be a situation where delaying negotiations with the United States might be the best strategy. I've mentioned, and so have the other witnesses, about the fact that we've delayed for the moment is good, that this can be part of the CUSMA renegotiation. But I wouldn't want to see Canada locked into anything with such an unpredictable administration as the one that we have in Washington right now. We've seen the threats concerning the 51st state. We saw the repeated claims to Greenland and a desire to acquire that entire island, notwithstanding the wishes of the people who live there. So to adopt a Canadian position, we should be ragging the puck right now when it comes to critical minerals in the United States. And while we're doing that, supporting Canadian industry, I mentioned having a price floor. Perhaps there's room for grants here, and there's certainly a lot of room for building infrastructure like roads and ports to make the investor community more attracted to having Canadian mines owned by Canadians. Thank you.
Mr. Anderson, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Dr. Stein, you were talking about government investment, and I'm just to clarify that, are you talking about incentivizing companies? Are you talking about direct government investment? Are you talking about nationalizing the industry?
I'm not talking about nationalizing the industry. I am talking about direct government investment. I'm talking about subsidies. I'm talking about tax incentives. And I am talking about things like the Canadian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So a variety of financial measures. I'm also thinking about the critical minerals stockpile. So we can have this in two formats. You can either have a big public stockpile, or you can have what is known as a private stockpile, where you pay companies to keep larger stocks.
And on that, On that, you said we've got intentions to stockpile. Have we made any progress on that, to your knowledge?
Well, it was only announced in the 2025 budget.
Are there any concrete steps being taken toward that?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Do you have any reasons why there have not? Are there any reasons direct that you're aware of why we have not pursued this?
Not that I am aware of.
Okay. I know we've heard concerns about the lengthy permitting processes for mining, and we've talked about that here as a matter of fact. Is there any indication that Canada is taking the hard steps to reduce some of the red tape and to move along on this?
Certainly, there's Bill C5, there's the Major Projects Office, there's the Indigenous Council that goes with the Major Projects Office. So I think we are moving in the right direction. But I said in my opening remarks that we need to also take a hard look at our notion of critical minerals and at the list itself. It doesn't help us to stockpile the wrong things.
No, exactly. I know that consulting often means I need to get it my way. That's what it's a euphemism for that, and that safety usually has a metric of 0, and if we don't achieve it, then it's no good. And I think that we've got to come off that, and I think you've indicated that we've got to move beyond that. Of the minerals considered critical for defence applications, how many can Canada actually mine, process, and refine domestically today?
That is a hard question for me to answer because I'm not a geologist. So I have had a hard look at the latest, the 2026 U.S. Geological Survey critical mineral review. And I would say we can probably mine at least 26 of the 30 or so minerals that I think are needed for security. But I stand to be corrected because I am not a geologist.
Okay. And on that, which specific defense systems require those? Well, let me be a little more specific. Batteries, electronics, precision-guided munitions, or communications equipment are most vulnerable to mineral shortages.
Well, things like gallium germanium for night vision goggles, rare earths for ballistic weapons, nickel, tungsten, chromium for anything that requires hardened steel. That off the top of my head. But what I can certainly do, Honourable Chair, is to provide the committee after the meeting with a more extensive list and a kind of a write-up that analyses this.
I would appreciate that. Mr. Hernandez-Roy, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I mentioned earlier in my opening remarks that Canada already mines and processes the 12 critical minerals that NATO considers to be essential for defense. Just a little carve out here for a second. The USGS list of critical minerals, I think there's 52.
60.
60 now? I know there's a new list. They added copper and things like that. I mean, some of them have greater commercial applications than defense applications. Some of them have very niche defense applications. And so you need to, if we're talking within a defense context, don't necessarily want to consider all of these minerals that are considered critical. Mm-hmm. Critical doesn't equate necessarily to defense. It just means critical for our industrial base and our defense industrial base.
Oh, yes.
But the 12, that NATO considers, and NATO obviously has just a defense lens, are aluminum, beryllium, cobalt, gallium, germanium, graphite, lithium, manganese, platinum, rare earths, titanium, and tungsten. Canada has reserves of all of these and produces some of these, some in great quantities, aluminum, for instance, and others in much more limited quantities like gallium and germanium, which apart from night vision goggles are also essential for semiconductor manufacturing.
Okay. On the back end of this,
Yeah, I'm going to pass it over to Ms. Raminato. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and through you, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us today. I want to start first with Professor Stein. You mentioned circular mining, and I wanted to get your opinion on what role can research,
defense research and innovation play in improving mineral efficiency, substitution, or recycling?
Absolutely. This is a crucial question. Thank you so much for this. So beginning with Natural Resources Canada, they've had a project called Value from Waste for a number of years now, which has really done extraordinary work on this. It's the CanMet mining division that does this project. But I think that Defence should be involved in this project as well because of the fact that they've been focused more on the energy transition. And so if we look more towards defense and security, then I think the metals that we are interested in are different. For instance, more towards rare earths, scandium, yttrium, things like that. The other thing is that we have vast reserves. We don't need to construct the mine to get to them. But there is a lot of research that still needs to go into the processing. I spoke recently with an engineer who explained to me that the technology is not quite there. So there is more research that needs to go, that needs to be funded for them to be able to really do it at scale.
Okay. We talked, you mentioned briefly in terms of the budget. As you know, we're going to be releasing our defense industrial strategy quite soon. And key initial investments include the $443 million over 5 years to Natural Resources Canada and ISED to support the development of innovative critical minerals processing technologies, support joint investments with allies in Canadian critical minerals, and to develop a critical minerals stockpiling mechanism to strengthen Canadian and allied national security. And I just wanted to flag to you, because you're probably not aware of that, the reason that has not been implemented yet is because the Budget Implementation Act is held up right now in committee, so it's being obstructed, so we haven't been able to actually implement the budget. So I just wanted to flag that to you. My next question is actually for Dr. Byers. You mentioned the Canada Investment Act, and in terms of some of the safeguards that have been put in place. I recall, I want to say in 2010, there was also a possible purchase of a potash mine, I believe. If I remember, it was an Australian company that wanted to purchase the Potash Act mine, and that didn't pass through because of national security reasons. Would you have any updates for us in terms of what we should be doing to strengthening the Investment Canada Act in terms of national security to make sure other projects are also protected?
Thank you for the question. And you're right about the potash company. I don't remember the details, but yes, this issue has cropped up repeatedly over the years. We have, as a result of amendments that were adopted after the RADARSAT-2 situation, we do have an explicit national security test. And my understanding is that the regulations that are being developed will enable the Government of Canada to review any proposed foreign investment concerning a list of particular minerals. And what goes on that list is probably still undetermined, but certainly rare earth elements, other critical minerals. So there's no threshold, and that's entirely appropriate. A national security review should happen at any time that a foreign company wants to buy in to Canadian critical minerals located here. So one of the things that you might do as members of Parliament is to make sure that those regulations don't compromise on that particular issue. So I know, for instance, that there's going to be a higher threshold with regards to the financial size of foreign investments when critical minerals are not at issue. This is as a result of Mr. Carney's trip to Beijing. But that is different. Here, if we're talking about critical minerals, rare earth elements, as long as the Canadian government has the ability to scrutinize any proposed investment into those areas, we are okay, provided that the bureaucracy and the political will is there to implement that. And if I could just take 20 seconds, all this is not just related to particular government initiatives concerning critical minerals in particular, but also major infrastructure projects. We need an all-weather road to Gray's Inlet in Nunavut to enable mining to be developed there. We need a hydroelectric line to Baker Lake and Rankin Inlet to support the mining industry there. This is all related. It's part of the entire government's push, and I'm generally supportive of that, and I would encourage you to look at the critical minerals issue in that broader perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Byers. Thank you, Mr. Reminato. Mr. Bazan, over to you.
Mr. Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses for appearing today. Now, we talk about the 5-year stockpile. Is that 5-year stockpile based upon Canada's needs or based upon Canada and our allies' needs?
The 5-year notion comes from Eisenhower in the US, who was saying that the country should have a 5-year stockpile in the event of war. He considered that to be a prudent amount for a country to have. I am proposing that simply as a measure. So that would be only for the country. That would not necessarily be for the allies. What I am saying is that Canada should look towards its own needs first and then towards the needs of its allies. There is a difference, though, between Canada and the United States in that we tend to produce much more minerals than the US historically did. In that sense, we would be able to support our allies to a far greater extent.
Okay, so we are looking at the new NATO metric for defense spending, the 3.5 plus 1.5. The 1.5% can be used for, just so we're clear, for stockpiles, for investments in mining operations, refining, processing operations, as well as the infrastructure to get those critical minerals to and from the mine to the end user. Is that correct?
This is my understanding.
Okay, and that's true for all of you? I see you're all shaking your heads. Okay. If we are looking at, and Mr. Anderson referred to the length of time it's taking to get projects approved, should we then be using the Defence Production Act in Canada as well, which doesn't get used that often, but the last version of it's 1985. Should that be updated? And should we be using national security exemptions to expedite the actual building of the mine's infrastructure and processing facilities required? Get around some of those timelines and problems that we're facing. Especially you mentioned the NIMBYs, and you're mentioning reluctance on behalf of some of our other partners, including the provinces, on how we actually get this done and process, create jobs and opportunity.
I'm smiling because I'm a professor of constitutional law. So this is a very difficult question for me to say yes. Yes, I think it is necessary to take steps. I would, before taking such a radical measure, I would engage in consultation. And one of the things that might work for communities is equity stakeholding. So I'm a proponent of softer measures that gets community buy-in, rather than hitting them over the head with a hammer.
Mr. Hernandez-Roy?
I agree with that. I think, Canada has a number of instruments. Some have been mentioned here. The Infrastructure Bank, the Export Development Bank, the new Sovereign Critical Minerals Fund. All of these things need to be applied to standing up the industry, standing up the infrastructure around it, and using the stockpile, which, if I'm correct, is only limited to 2 minerals at this point, which clearly to me would seem to be insufficient. But to use those for meeting our NATO commitments as well.
We're talking about the critical minerals, rare earth elements that China seems to have a great deal of control over, not just within mainland China, but PRC influence and ownership in mines in Africa and the Americas. How and you look at how COVID impacted us on how critical supply chains were disrupted, and Russia and China hold the hammer on a lot of these critical minerals. Case in point, helium is another one that's really necessary in the production of semiconductors. And so Korea, Japan, and Taiwan are really concerned about access to helium. So is there a role here for Canada, again, to ensure that two of our adversarial nations, being Russia and China, don't have complete control of some of these critical minerals?
That's
just beyond, the 30 that you're listing here. Like, actually, if you dig down on supply chains, impacts on the economy, impacts on manufacturing lines, it's a much bigger list than what we currently are looking at, is it not?
certainly, it goes back to the issue of critical minerals being not just minerals for defense, but minerals for the broader economy. So we should be looking at where there are bottlenecks that are important to our economy here in the United States, and then secondarily to maybe allied countries. The other thing I think that's worth mentioning is this issue of Canada, mining in Canada, but Canadian mining companies being sort of, some of the most important mining companies in the world. And we should be looking at possible investments in mines in other jurisdictions. I focus on Latin America, so I think a lot about Latin America, where for 20 years now, the Chinese have dominated the mining scene in terms of having feedstocks go to China for then being refined in China. And we should be thinking about ways, the Biden administration tried to do this in some ways. We should be thinking about ways to enter into new long-term offtakes agreements so that feedstock is diverted from China, or doesn't go to China as much, but goes to refiners in allied jurisdictions. That could be Canada, that could be the U.S. doesn't have very much refining capability, but you try to see where there were refiners in countries that are stable and are our allies.
Thank you. Thank you. I know Dr. Byers, your hand is up, but it is Mr. Mallet's time, so I'm going to pass it over to him, and we'll see how it goes from there.
Thank you, and I have a question for Professor Byers as well, so it may be what you were interested in speaking. My first question, however, is to Professor Stein, and it relates to consultation, as we talked about earlier in a question from my friend regarding some communities. Are there national security risks that could arise if projects proceed without stable legal and Indigenous partnership foundations?
Absolutely.
Can you expand on where we might see some of those issues arise, or how they may arise?
Well, if we talk about Indigenous consultation not happening, we will see the fabric of society tear apart. And I don't think I am exaggerating here. We have seen with UNDRIP, with Indigenous rights coming forward, we've seen a movement now. Recently, where First Nation members have said this will be like Kanawaki, just much worse. I don't think we want to go there. I don't think we have to go there.
That to my point, that is how critical, and I believe that Indigenous partnership and consultation on any of what we're talking about is critical. Thank you very much. Professor Byers, I know you had your hand up on the previous question, but given the large majority of Canada's critical mineral processing is done in foreign countries, most notably China, what investments or strategies are being implemented or should be implemented in order to decrease the reliability on other countries to ensure full end-to-end domestic supply chains? I'm talking mining, processing, manufacturing, even recycling.
Thank you for that question. I just want to start by adding a point concerning Aboriginal rights. It is important for us to recognize that yes, we need critical minerals as a nation state. But it may be that for a particular indigenous group that a caribou herd is a critical resource, and you know a critical resource is very much in the eye of the beholder. It depends on your position. It depends upon your particular needs and self-interests, and so this is not necessarily obstructionism for the sake of obstructionism. That's just my point. There will always be need for not just consultation but for compromise. On the issue of investments generally, I also want to point out that we are talking about a long-term process here. It can take 20 years to develop a single mining operation. It can take 10 or 20 years to develop the infrastructure to support mining operations in some remote location. And so I felt some frustration from one of the members of this committee a few minutes ago about the pace of movement here. My general sense is that the current government is moving quickly and for the most part getting decisions correct. You know, one can always second guess, but I would suggest that this needs to be an all of Canada process, and that there needs to be buy-in from all the different political parties. We are in a state of geopolitical urgency right now, and it does not simply concern China. I'm glad this discussion is taking place, but please be patient with the government. It's going to take time to make this happen, and so you know we need to be careful, but we also need to be patient. Thank you.
Thank you. One last question, then, if I may, to Professor Stein. As president of the G7, Canada's launched the G7 Critical Minerals Action Plan and unlocked the first round of strategic projects under the Critical Minerals Production Alliance. These 26 new investments, partnerships, and measures will accelerate and unlock $6.4 billion of critical mineral projects. And we do it to the highest environmental, labor, and Indigenous partnership standards anywhere in the world. And this circles back to my prior question. What advantages do those latter standards and practices, in your estimation, bring us in attracting partnerships outside of, say, the U.S., which doesn't seem to give much credence to those standards and practices? Does that help our case in that regard in developing partnerships on these critical mineral issues?
It does, because it is exactly in accordance with the European Union critical raw material standards. And this is a phenomenal market. It's much more than we can supply, in fact.
Thank you. Okay, Monsieur Savard Tremblay. 2.5.
C'est bon, merci.
Mr. Savard Tremblay, 2.5 minutes. Thank you. I think it was you, Mr. Hernandez Roy. You talked a bit about Chinese geopolitics regarding critical minerals. Essentially, Chinese efforts are being developed where? I know that they're very strong in Africa. Is that one of their areas of importance and influence as regards obtaining these minerals? And I think you would like to add something too. Go ahead. Precisely, it's not only Africa. They have mines in Africa, for sure, but they have a strong presence in Latin America as well. The south of Latin America, Chile, Peru, and especially those two countries are the biggest producers of copper in the world. And most of their exports go to China. They also export to North America, but raw product is sent to China mainly and is refined there. So They have mines everywhere around the world, concentrated in Africa and in South America. Yes, and something to add?
Had in Africa, and you can hear from my accent that I'm from South Africa originally, has had in Africa a phenomenal foothold. It has this infrastructure for concessions model, whereby it will go into a country, construct infrastructure, such as a port, and in return get a mine concession. And in that way, it has really built up mineral expertise throughout Africa. For instance, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is the biggest producer of cobalt in the world, also copper, a very big producer of copper. It's in Zambia, very strong in Zambia, Zimbabwe, in Angola, in South Africa. We find them everywhere in Africa.
Je me demandais aussi,
I was also wondering, we know that on another committee a few years ago, I was involved in a study on Canadian mines, and there was a certain laxity about what defines a Canadian mine. Registration is quite simple, but often it's not really Canadian mining companies that are actually doing it. Do you have any information that the Chinese might be registered as Canadian mining companies, but in actual fact, they're Chinese interests?
The Panama, Copper Panama, we see them operate in Africa very often. It will look like a Canadian mining company. It's known as a Canadian mining company, but all of the employees are Chinese.
In the South American context, under the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act, there were tax incentives for countries that had free trade agreements with the United States, where they could have tax rebates on minerals that were exported to the United States, so long as the companies that were exporting had less than 25% Chinese ownership in them. And as a result of looking into that, we did some research at CSIS on this, and a number of copper companies in South America are held by other companies that are held by other companies that are in fact specifically designed to hide their Chinese ownership. So this is something, it seems to be a practice that is widespread.
Thank you. Mr. Kibble, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Professor Stein, you mentioned, and I guess we're seeing it across the world, China exerting control over minerals and trying to hide it. As you gave an example in Africa and in South America as well, whether it's employees or control of the minerals or the export. Should we expect the same here, and should we protect ourselves from the same here in Canada?
We should, and I have seen companies operating in Canada where we have the same thing. If they are listed on the TSX, then we should ask ourselves who are the shareholders behind them.
Perfect. I would love a list of all of those companies. Any critical minerals that countries such as, say China, in terms of defense, that they do not have access to, and that we have access to here in Canada? And if so, is this something that we should be selling to them or keeping for ourselves?
I don't think there are any critical minerals that China does not have access to.
Fair enough. Maybe we consider that for some other countries as well. Should we expect our critical mineral sites to become active targets, Mr. Hernandez, right, active targets for our adversaries, either economically or strategically? And, as we discussed earlier, China seems to want to play by its own rules.
Active targets in the sense of for acquisition?
For acquisition, for control, for predatory practices, or even as, God forbid, military type targets.
Well, I mean, we've engaged in some pure speculation about what would happen if, the Chinese one day decided to land in some remote location in the Canadian Arctic because there happens to be a critical mineral deposit there and establish a presence, and then what do we do about that? I think that's just pretty much in the fantasy realm right now, but it's worth thinking about. But in terms of those minerals that are critical to our national well-being and certainly to our defense need to be protected against any sort of foreign ownership, or at least reviewed against any foreign ownership and safeguarded against that.
What about, and I said strategic, but things such as cyber attacks that will shut down and control and damage our production? Is that a risk from countries like China?
Certainly, but not just for the mines. I think more importantly, it's the infrastructure that can be targeted. I mean, we've seen targets against the Port of Montreal, for instance.
Thank you. And targets
It's
attacks, from...
Pardon me?
From who?
I mean, foreign adversaries, China is certainly
Okay.
one. Russia, and I think, was the particular source in the case of the Montreal attack.
Okay, thank you. So the government has declared China as our new strategic partner. Should this include sharing our defense-related critical minerals with them, maybe help them stockpile? Or is this something we should guard against, and is there a risk to that?
I think the Prime Minister, and I'm just speaking from what I've seen in the press, has made it clear that the partnership is entered in with eyes wide open, knowing that there are certain purely commercial relationships, oil, foodstuffs, but that the trading relationship will not rise to the level of certain goods or certain materials that are sensitive to national
The
security.
term strategic partnership was what was used. So in your opinion, should we define what that is limited to in terms of what strategic partnership is, and should that include access to or supplying of critical minerals to China?
I don't think we should be supplying. Well, again, it goes back to the definition of what critical minerals are, for instance.
Defense-related critical minerals.
Yeah.
So although we now have a strategic partnership, you feel that we should exclude critical minerals from that in terms of supply.
I think that the
I'll
term
let you finish
strategic
and then-
relationship might be a bad use of the word. I mean, it's essentially agricultural products for EVs and
It doesn't sound
oil.
strategic. I'm talking in a defense.
Exactly.
Perhaps Professor Stein, you could elaborate as well.
Through the chair, Mr. Kibble, I would suggest that maybe Canada needs to have a definition of not only critical minerals, but also strategic minerals.
And I'll take that to account. I guess I sort of already asked that one, but would you consider crude oil as a critical mineral, both economically and strategically? And further, should we be stockpiling fossil fuel from a defense perspective?
We should have a certain stockpile of oil. The United States has had a strategic petroleum reserve for decades. In the case of Canada selling more oil to China than it has in the past, this is a direct result of the need for Canada to diversify its trading relationship, given an aggressive sort of economic coercion of Canada by the current administration in the White House. So we're selling more oil to China because there is an international market for oil, and it can buy it from Saudi Arabia or it can buy it from us.
It's of selling oil. I'm not against that, but just more from a strategic partnership and stockpiling and controlling. What do you feel, Professor Stein, we need to do best to protect our supply? It's a very broad question, and maybe I'll go around the room for it, but in my last few seconds here, what do we need to best to protect our supply of critical minerals from a defense perspective, from our adversaries, so that we can support things like a critical stockpile, a 5-year stockpile? So just quick fire around the table if we could.
Very quickly, define what strategic minerals are, stockpile them, and safeguard them.
Safeguard them from
Safeguard
adversaries.
them from adversaries.
Thank you. Would you agree, Mr. Hernandez-Roy?
I have argued in certain papers that stockpiling is necessary, and it's necessary not only for to hedge against prolonged conflict. Much of the thinking is as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it's also critical while we build up our own critical minerals industry. To safeguard from China, it's important for us to have a reserve that can cushion us against price shocks from China.
Yeah, I appreciate.
Dr. Byers, I think
No worries, Mr. Kibble. We'll have a few more
I
few more
appreciate your
questions.
leniency.
Mr. Lapointe, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. My waiting in airport lounge reading these days is a book called Mining is Dead, Long Live Geopolitical Mining. It was recommended to me by a constituent, and I'm grateful to him. I'll just quickly read a passage because I think it speaks to the study that we're doing at this committee currently. As critical minerals have gained importance, governments worldwide have elevated mining and mineral supplies into key issues of national security and foreign policy. What was once left in the hands of mining companies and commodity traders is now a priority on the agendas of presidents, defense ministries, and diplomats. So it speaks to what we're talking about here today. Mr. Hernandez-Roy, in allied cooperation, and I'd really like to hear your thoughts on this, where is the line between collaboration and overdependence when it comes to strategic materials?
If I knew that, I mean, I think it's when the majority of your relationship is only with one client, right? You need to have more than one trading partner, more than one client in order to hedge against the effects of overdependence when it becomes used as a tool of coercion. So I don't know where that fine line is, but it does mean that that while Canada should still be, say, having the United States as a really important, if not its primary source or its primary client in terms of critical minerals, we should be leaning into Europe very heavily. And we've seen that the government is moving in that direction.
Professor Stein, what steps would strengthen Canada's position as a trusted partner, but without putting its own security at risk?
I think we should first look out for ourselves. We should get away from this Canadian notion of selfless service. And I love being Canadian, for the record. But just we should first look after ourselves.
And my next question goes to all of the witnesses here today. When Canada's allies talk about trusted suppliers, what are they really looking for beyond the presence of just minerals in the ground? And I'll start with you, Mr. Hernandez-Roy.
So the question is what?
So when we talk about trusted suppliers,
yeah.
What are the allies really looking for beyond just the critical minerals that we have in the ground?
Well, I mean, just within allies or just broadly talking about critical? So, I mean, the very first thing that comes to mind, of course, is China's manipulation and coercion and using critical minerals as a trade cudgel. So that's number one. We want to not trade or to have mineral dependency on any country that is going to weaponize that relationship in a moment of crisis or for some economic gain. Then we also want to have partners who might otherwise be reliable partners, but who in a crisis will also not, let's say within the G7, if we have relationships with critical minerals, say with Germany, which is in the news a lot because of maybe the submarine deal. And I'm not picking on Germany for any reason, but my point is, in a crisis, we still want to make sure that it remains a trusted partner, meaning an ally, a friend in fair and foul weather.
Professor Stein?
Slightly different angle. I agree with all of that. But I think we should also look towards other countries in similar type of situations. And I have in mind here specifically Kazakhstan, because Kazakhstan is sitting with China on its back the way that we have the US on our border. So Kazakhstan is very mineral rich. If you look at all the minerals they have, they don't necessarily want to be dominated by China, and they don't immediately have an off-take market.
And Dr. Byers?
I think what I can add to the conversation here is that we are a trading country, and there's no reason to stop being a trading country. The issue is how do we protect the integrity of our mining sector within Canada from malicious actors. And so I come back again to the fact that under the Investment Canada Act and the new regulations, the Government of Canada has to be able and should scrutinize every single foreign investment into rare earth elements and certain other critical minerals to be defined by the government in consultation with experts from the geology sector. But the point here is that we don't want to close ourselves off. We benefit from trading. We just need to make sure that we're not locked into situations that we can't get out of if a particular ally were to turn on us in some negative way. And I do very much support Professor Stein's encouragement that we look to the European Union as our next big market opportunity, given that there's more stability there at the moment than there is in the United States.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Byers. Thank you, Ms. Lapointe. Mr. Bazan, a couple of minutes, and then I would like to go into some other issues that we have to resolve. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Just want to follow up on what Dr. Byers was just saying, and also up to the other witnesses as well. There's been, we talked about the Foreign Investment Act, and maybe the thresholds in there are too high. Maybe they should be narrowed down. I bring to your attention the Tanko mine, which is actually headquartered in my riding, owned by Sinomine, bought off the New York Stock Exchange. It was below the automatic trigger for foreign investment review. It produces lithium, tantalum, all on the critical minerals list, as well as cesium. All of it is shipped raw to China. So, the government turned a blind eye to this several years ago. The Biden administration, I believe, was in power. It might have been the tail end of the Trump administration. They never said anything because it was off the New York Stock Exchange. Do we need to have stronger oversight and thresholds of these more insidious investments that look like commercial acquisition rather than actually investments in critical minerals?
Are you asking me?
First.
Yes, I very much share your concern. I think a mistake was made with regards to oversight in that particular instance, and that's precisely the kind of situation we need to guard against in the future. And I share Professor Stein's concern that companies like Chinese companies will seek to engage in multiple incorporations, sometimes in different jurisdictions, in order to hide the paper trail that leads back to the ultimate ownership. So that's where the scrutiny has to take place. The Government of Canada should be able to do this. If it can't do it now, in all necessary instances, it needs to develop that capability. The other thing I will say, just in response to an earlier point that you asked a few minutes ago, is that I'm not concerned about China physically invading Canada, but I'm very concerned about espionage, particularly as we develop new technologies. I'm very concerned about sabotage. Anyone who sees what Russia is doing with regards to Europe, things like the jamming of GPS signals, or drones shutting down airports in peaceful areas of Europe. There's a general level of harassment that we need to be prepared for. It doesn't just concern critical minerals, but we can't be naive about other countries. We live in a dangerous world, and balancing that.
Can I just interject there quickly because the time's running short? When we look at the specifics of the Tanko mine in Manitoba, knowing that tantalum is actually used in weapons, it's used in armor, it has a very much a defense purpose. In these situations, like I argued against the government to not do this, several years ago. They still went ahead because of the low threshold, or the threshold, it was below the thresholds that were in place. Should we now revisit that on the grounds of national security and have that force Sinomine to divest?
I think it needs to be considered. The government certainly has the power to expropriate that resource. Expropriation is something that trade-loving countries don't tend to embrace, but in a situation of national security, it certainly is an option.
Professor Stein?
I would recommend putting together a strategic list of minerals and revisiting the ownership of all of those strategic mineral mines.
Just a point of order, Mr. Chair. Professor Stein, in her opening comments, had a complete list and, like 10, 15 points. Can we make sure that gets circulated around to everyone, as well as speaking notes of all of our witnesses today? And any strategic lists that you think we should be aware of, please send them in.
And that's a great way to wrap up. I appreciate that. Anything you can share the committee would be welcome. It's certainly a study that I think all of us are concerned about as we go forward, especially around the sovereignty, but also with the economic impacts that it's going to have long term. Again, thank you to the witnesses for being here. I appreciate your time and your testimony. I have some housekeeping matters, folks, before we leave. You've been shared 4 budgets, and I just want to go through them quickly so that we can adopt them so I can then sign them and proceed. Pardon me?
I do have some questions.
You do have questions? You want to proceed with the questions now?
On the budget? Yeah.
Yeah, so there's one that's a trip to Colorado Springs.
Do you want to do this in camera? Or?
That's probably not a bad idea. Folks, to the witnesses, thank you again very much. We're going to suspend and go into camera.